Thank you so much for agreeing to talk to us today. Can you get us started by introducing yourself? So, your background, expertise, and experience.
Sure. I'm Kathryn Oliver. I'm now Professor of Evidence and Policy at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I've been working on the relationship between evidence and policy in different ways for about 20 years. I really started focusing on, or being involved rather, with systematic review programs, which were delivering evidence for policy for various different government departments in the UK. But I became more and more interested in what happened on the other side of the desk, if you like. So what happened when the policymakers received evidence. And then since between sort of 2019 and 2023, I was seconded into the Government Office of Science, which is the science advice bit of the UK government. And there I was supporting the science capability work that was ongoing across governments. That was all about trying to increase the number of scientists in government, improve the way that government could respond to scientific information and draw on it. And my role there was to try and improve how government articulated its knowledge needs to external stakeholders through something called the areas of research interest, but also to think broadly about how the science system operated internally and how it interfaced with different stakeholders such as universities, individual academics, funders, national academies, and so on.
Do you have suggestions for practical strategies that researchers can use when they're engaging with policymakers, taking into account, as you said, the differences between the sort of industries, if I could put it that way?
I would start by saying, look at the system that already exists and look at the channels of communication that already exist, rather than trying to initiate a new discussion about the research that you're doing. So I think the most useful task you can undertake as a researcher is to find out where that discussion's happening and who's having it. So who's already talking about the problems that you're talking about, and how can you ask to be invited and included in those discussions in the most constructive and polite way. What tends to work less well is basically cold calling policymakers and trying to interest them in your study or inviting them to come and hear about your research. It might work sometimes. You might get some attention, but if your goal is long-term change, think about initiating relationships that will turn into professional partnerships where you're both on the same team trying to achieve change together rather than one person trying to make a hard sell. You see what I mean?
I want to chat a little bit about networking and relationship building and how important do you think that is between researchers and policymakers?
So it's not that simply having a contact or knowing who to talk to is a sort of prerequisite for impact. It's more that if you get to know people who are working in a policy area, who have a specific set of challenges, who have specific questions for experts, etc., then you're more likely to take those concerns and interests on board when you do your research, and your research is more likely to be useful. You're also more likely to be in a position to answer questions when they have them. So they're more likely to contact you, and also that offers opportunities to be influential. But I think it's important to bear in mind that they're hardly ever going to phone and say, what's going on in your research project? They're nearly always going to phone and say, look, on balance, what would you say about X? What they want is a view from across a whole discipline or, ideally a group of disciplines about what the evidence says in a particular area. So I think it's important to remember that to them, you're a representative of an academic network in its own right, not just a single expert with a single sort of research portfolio. But I think also it's possible to be very influential and not do any of that. Networking is not for everyone. And I think it's slightly unfortunate language because it gives the impression that to be influential, you have to be very charismatic and very confident and the sort of person who's happy to go to a reception at the House of Lords and go up to anybody and introduce yourself and give the elevator pitch and all of that. And I think that's all rubbish. I don't think you have to do any of that in order to be a good collaborator with decision makers. I think you can very well thrive without doing any of that. And that's why I come back to think about the mechanisms and structures that are there already, because actually they are designed to elicit inputs from a number of different places and different channels and different ways.
Are there any specific challenges that you've seen in the engagement between the research community and government or policy partners?
Yes, several, although I would say that it's become much, the idea that researchers should be engaging with policy and practice partners has become much more common in the UK. Having said that, it is generally not recognised nearly as well as getting money, getting grants in or getting good applications. It's not rewarded as well. There's very little training for it. There's almost no internal support unless you're at one of the really big universities. So those are all real constraints for academics. On the policy side, the constraints are really more around resources. So if you think there's 23 government departments in the UK, 160 universities or something, it's not like universities even coordinate within their own organisation about who's contacting which departments. So it's not unusual for government departments to receive hundreds upon hundreds of requests, sometimes demands for signatures for letters of interest, responses to, we want to include you in our grant proposal. Can you please get back to us by the end of the day? Or here's my research project that I think you should read about. Can I ask why you haven't changed policy yet? Sometimes the tone is a little self-centered, but having said that, there's only so many of them and they can't respond to everything. So how do they prioritize? And how do they prioritize with a view to, increasing equality, diversity and inclusion in the engagement space? How do they make sure that they're not just always going to the people they know can deliver? And because it basically runs on goodwill, if they have a bad experience, it makes it more difficult for the next academic through the door. So if someone's rude or overpromises and underdelivers or goes AWOL or is very extractive about the whole experience, all of those things make it more difficult and make it less likely that policy colleagues will want to continue engaging, particularly engaging so openly to new people who are newer to it. So, it's a very common criticism of people always going to the usual suspects, but the truth is, it's because it's much less risky for them, not in terms of what they're going to hear, but in terms of knowing the process is going to work okay.